Hi, I'm John Corcoran, Executive Director of the American Rose Society. So glad you decided to join us this Saturday morning for week 2 of the Consulting Rosarian School that will cover fertilizers and insects and diseases. As you can see on your screen right now, we have a banner up for our convention that we will hold at the American Rose Center May 5th through the 7th. We hope you will come and join us. There's going to be wonderful speakers there as well. And I'd be remiss if I did not recognize some of our silver sponsors that have been able to make sure this convention will happen, including Jackson & Perkins, Bonide, and Heirloom Roses. Also, while you're coming, May through 5th to the 7th, and I hope you book today, you will also be able to see the International Rose Test Garden, which we recently got certified by the World Federation, and you can actually participate in selecting the People's Choice Award while you're there. So we hope you will come join us May 5th through the 7th at the American Rose Center, or known as America's Rose Garden. Gary?
Hey there, my name is Gary Chin. Welcome everyone. Today, as John indicated, we have a couple of wonderful programs, one entitled Fertilizers by Mr. Art Wade and Insects and Diseases by Mr. Baldo Villegas. Once the presentations has been completed, we will go into a 15-minute verbal Q&A session. This Q&A session will be a little different. If you are a consulting Rosarian candidate, ask your question, but before you ask your question, write down that you are a candidate and you will be given priority during this Q&A session. And if you have a comment, use the chat bot and we'll catch your comments there. Otherwise, use the question and answer bot. And now I'll turn it over to Mr. Wadi's background. Dita.
Yes. Kim Merritt, John Corcoran, Gary Chin, Neil Stapleton, and all the folks at ARS in Shreveport making this happen. Greatest thanks. Shout out to Jerry Dreyer, Central District, for posting these seminars on various Facebook sites. My name is Anita Eckley, National Consulting Rosarian Co-Chair, and it is my distinct privilege on behalf of the American Rose Society to welcome you to our interactive seminar on fertilizer presented by Art Wade. We have hosted over 500 folks that have attended this series since last Saturday, February 4th. Today's information has crucial thoughts about our gardening impact on the new 2023 season through Art Wade's insistence on best practices. We are delighted to welcome international attendees and our own United States attendees. This response reminds us all of the importance of our individual search in the environmentalist do no harm. The American Rose Society honors those practices of how to grow the best rose plants without depleting our soil or negatively impacting our waterways. Our mission is to present a step-by-step fertilizing while doing no harm. Art Wade will present this thoughtful practicalities. Logistically, we need to mention the bookkeeping portion. This concerns our mentored CR candidates, as well as our 18 consulting Rosarian chairs. The test from this series will be sent to CR candidates after Valentine's Day. Candidates will have from midnight to February 16th to midnight February 17th to complete the test. The test may be retaken until you receive a passing score. Again, a separate logistical piece to those of us who record national information and those of us who are registering to become CRs. Michael Eckley, National CR Co-Chair, will be sending to the 18 chairpersons of each district the Excel spreadsheet. This spreadsheet contains when you sign in and when you leave each session. This is extremely important. Please try to stay for the entire speaker and questioning to receive your full credit. Note, a computer is best for logins. We are honored to have Art Wade and Satish. Satish is well known for his extensive knowledge base and will be answering questions not selected for Art's oral response. Art is well known for his esteemed practical response to what works to produce the best results. 1/4 of the questions on the mentioned exam will be from his program. Art has brought his impressive passion and knowledge to gardeners of all abilities. He has particular expertise in old garden roses, those roses grown in his own nursery, the Rose Petal. His interests span the membership in local Florida societies and the Rose Society Heritage Foundation. His practicality has led to commercial certificates in fertilizer as well as pesticide application. Before I turn this over to Art, I want to say to all of our attendees, welcome. It's great to see so many of you here. It was 450 and counting before I lost the numbers. My husband, Mike Eckley, and myself hope to see you face to face at our national celebration in Shreveport, May 5 to 7. Come home to the Rose Garden is May's Shreveport's convention theme. Now we can learn and celebrate together. I hope that Art Wade inspires you to have discussions about the best regenerative practices. By individually implementing Art's ideas, each of us contributes to a legacy for future growers. And I'd like to turn this over to Art.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Anita, for that nice introduction. And I wanted to thank everyone that was involved in supporting the presentation I'm going to give, Satish, and all of the folks with ARS. One of the things that I wanted to address before we get started with the actual PowerPoint is a few things of importance, mainly to the CR candidates. And in this presentation, it's focused for your information and assistance in taking this test. And one of the things that you'll see in the PowerPoint is highlighted entries, and I'll talk about them, but if you see an entry in red, it's one that you will probably want to make some notes and be prepared to look at those notes later on. And the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit with the CRs is this is a PowerPoint that is prepared for all of the US. So it is kept fairly general. And when you are a CR and are preparing yourself to answer questions, there's some things that I would suggest that you do early on. And some of those would be to talk with some of your master Rosarians and your other CRs in your area. But there's a couple of places that I found that were very helpful in getting information about fertilizers. And that's with the local county extension agents. Also, if you have access to review some of the materials that your state's university publish on in support of your agricultural communities, those have been really, really helpful here. And then, of course, there's another area that I have found people have been super helpful with me, and that's at some of the fertilizer and chemical supply companies that mainly deal with agricultural customers, but a lot of nurseries also go there. Anyhow, these folks are usually very, very helpful, and of course are very knowledgeable in their areas and what works there and what is best. And I mention this as an example because here in Florida, one of the products that we would use here is a 9-month time release fertilizer, which is something that other parts of the US, you're not going to use something that is a 9-month. If you use any time release at all, it's going to be probably a shorter period. But some of these folks that I mentioned earlier would be good sources to go to. trying right now to get this screen up. I'm having a little difficulty.
So Art, down at the bottom of your screen, you see that orange circle that has a P in it? At the very, very bottom, where your icons are?
Right on your taskbar, right next to type to search here, right there. Keep going over, two more to the orange one. You're on the go to meeting, just go 2 over, click on that.
Okay,
There.
all right, there we go. Thank you.
All right.
When I was talking about some of the different problems that you're going to be facing or seeing in your areas, things that, you know, we have and encounter here in Florida are extremely sandy soils. So consequently, some of the fertilizers that we are going to be using, the compositions are not going to be something that would work in all areas. You know, if you're in an area where your soils are heavy clay or any of the other compositions beyond the sand, you know, your folks there will be able to help you come up with things that are much better suited. This, as I was saying before, this PowerPoint is one that is prepared for the ARS and is designed and intended to support this program that we're giving now for the CRs. When we talk about fertilizers, you know, we think about all of the different varieties, and we're going to discuss some of the different formulations and compositions. But basically, dictionary definitions is it's any material, and to include manure and chemicals that you would use to improve your soil or the quality of your plant growth. When we think about plants, we think about the nutrients that go into that plant. And what's many people, you know, think that don't really understand that 90%, 95% of that plant is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And where those are going to be obtained from the air and water, your remaining nutrients are going to come from the soil. And, you know, many in our soil, we have some naturally occurring, but to add the fertilizers to give them what they would need to produce the best rows and give you the strongest plants. This breakdown gives a little bit more idea as to the percentages of nutrients are going to, and elements that are going to come from the soil. And you can see how that small 5% is made up of these components. We're going to see and talk about these different elements in the explanation of the commercial fertilizers, especially in the labeling. We'll talk about many of these elements. When we get started with our process of identifying fertilizers and using fertilizers, one of the key things we need to always think about is the pH of our soil. Now, all of us know the neutral is at 7, and the roses will tolerate a range that's anywhere from 5.5 to 7.8. So when you were asked as a CR about things that are needed or what to do, probably the first thing is to say, have you tested your soil? And then with that information, you'll have an idea of what the pH is. Ideally, you want to be in the range of a 6.0 to 6.5. And this is a chart that use and see many, many times, talking about the neutral being at 7. This scale is based on a powers of 10, and this is a point that you're going to see again later on. So when you have a pH of 5, it's 10 times more acidic than a pH of 6. And this particular point here is one you'll want to remember, how much, many times difference it is between 5 and 7. One of the points that we always need to remember about fertilizers is that regardless of whether they're chemical or organic, they tend to make your soil more acidic. And this is a common theme and a common problem, just something that we will deal with and know we always have it there. Now this chart and example is, you see it in many, many different settings because it is valuable to us with roses. It gives us an idea of where the various nutrient fall and are absorbed at the range that we were looking for our roses, at 6 to 6.5. And this particular one does show all of the primary plant nutrients as well as the secondaries and the micro or trace elements. Again, here's some things that'll be important later on. If your soil is acidic, you're talking about adding lime to the pH. You need to test the soil to determine the level of the magnesium that's present, because this will help in determining the type of limestone that you'll be using or want to use for correcting the pH levels. If it's sufficient, if the magnesium amount present, then you can use the calcidic that is not, well, it doesn't have the magnesium, where the dolomite, if it is low, if your magnesium is low, then you can use dolomite as a more powerful or has a more presence. If your soil is alkaline, you can add compost or peat, and this will affect the pH a slight amount. If you're trying to make something happen more quickly, then sulfur is what's going to be used to more rapidly lower that alkaline. In labels for fertilizers, the 3 primary components that we will see, this is in this particular bag is a good example: nitrogen first, phosphorus second, and then your potassium. The nitrogen, it's one of the main components that's going to fuel your plant growth. This helps in giving that plant the strong canes and to grow taller. Gives that plant the rich and dark foliage that you want. Now, if it's lacking nitrogen, your foliage is going to tell you. You're going to see that it's a lighter green, sometimes almost yellow. On the other hand, if it's too much, you'll know this plant looks like it's been burned, and the plant over time will end up weak and with small blooms. The next of the elements that we saw on our label is the phosphorus. This stimulates the plant growth. In other words, we're talking about something more, the root growth. That's significant for you to remember for later on. And it also helps this quality plant to have big blooms. It does, one of the things that it does help with too is to aid in your winter hardiness of the rose. Now, if it is you have an acidic soil, this can be locked up and it moves, this particular nutrient moves very slowly. And many of you that have been growing roses for some time we talk about or know that the Rosarians will recommend using some type of a phosphate, and many of them use the superphosphate or triple superphosphate, and put that in the hole at the time of the plant you're planting. The third of the three components that we see on the label is the potassium. This promotes overall growth and vigor and bloom color throughout the whole year. This is essential in the development of your chlorophyll and encouraging photosynthesis in the plant's leaves. It also aids in moving the nutrients throughout this plant. And one thing to remember is that it moves quickly through the soil, and it's one that needs replenishment on a regular basis. On that fertilizer label, after we look at the three primary ingredients that we see mentioned before, the label itself is a guarantee of what the composition of this particular fertilizer is. And it's something that's tested, and here in Florida, the state monitors and is involved in making sure that this is an accurate depiction. Now, one of the areas on this label that you might want to remember later on is this little red highlight. Water insoluble nutrient is also, you'll see it as WIN, W-I-N, and it's something that you might want to keep in mind as well. But this is under the nitrogen and the way that the components of this nitrogen percentage, how it's broken down. Again, the label does tell you not only the primary, but it'll also go into the secondary and the trace elements and give you the percentages for each. The secondary micronutrients that we were talking about were calcium, helps with making this a sturdier plant. Magnesium, now this is one, you remember we talked about it before when we were discussing the pH and adding the type of lime for changing your pH. It's essential, and it's an element that is recognized. And the final one of the three secondaries is the sulfur. And this is one of the components that will also help with lowering in the pH. The minor nutrients, micronutrients that are listed on that label and are involved in the health of our plants also are known as trace elements. So you may see that again too. Now here, these are, you only need very small amounts for the roses. But what's also something to keep in mind is that if you are lacking any of these, you can also see that there is maybe causing a decrease in the availability of these major elements. One of the things is iron. Manganese is another one that helps with the aids with the chlorophyll formulation. So this is a minor element, but it's important. And this is with the whole photosynthesis. One of the other minors that you see, trace elements, is zinc. And this will help stimulate stem growth and flower production. Another one is boron. Not only does it help with controlling the starch formation, but it will stimulate cell division and flower formation. Copper does help with the stem development. And you also have some added to make the amino acid and stimulate more plant growth and vigor. When we talk about fertilizers, there's different forms. And by forms, we're talking about the appearance and the construct of it. Granular is one that is designed to be basically added directly to the soil, scratched in. Now, some of these granulars may also be identified as water soluble. The powdered fertilizers, these are designed to dissolve in water and use primarily in the liquid feeding, both as a drench in the soil or as a foliar spray or to use on the foliage. Now, a liquid, you can have this, it's sold in a concentrated form, and again, you're mixing it with water, and the same application processes can be used where it's a direct drench or as foliar spray. One area, and this is, some people use it, it's not used much here, is the solid or the spikes that are put around, and this tends to be one that dissolves or breaks down slowly. Now, when we talk about types of fertilizers, we have the organic and the chemical. With the organic, now these include the more common ones that we see here. They tend to be low in nutrient content and for the most part are slow release. They also are common to have high levels of carbon, and they will also slowly add the humus to your soils. With your chemical fertilizers, you'll see that the ones we talked about before, the granular and all, are composed of synthetic chemicals and or minerals. These are ones that considered an inorganic. Now, general, all of your chemical fertilizers are salts, which can interfere with your water availability to your roots. And these chemicals, they tend to be more quick acting than your organic. And what's interesting is that the plants themselves, they do not tell the difference between the chemical or the organic elements. With the organic, it's something that, for those of you that have tried to work with the organic fertilizers, they really have much lower percentages of the primary components than what you can get with your inorganics or your chemical fertilizer. Some of the different organics that you see are ones that are, I can only refer to them as some of the old school, where you heard family or in your research, historical research, you'll see the cottonseed meal, blood meal, bone meal, all used as organics. Now, alfalfa meal is one that I want to take a moment and talk about this, because it's one I use quite often in combination with our spring fertilizing, and we'll also add it in sometime in the fall. This is contains tricotinol, which is something that is a growth enhancer or growth stimulator. Now, we use the pelletized form and let it break down, but you also see this applied as a tea, where you take and allow the alfalfa pellets or crushed pellets to be put into a water solution and allowed to sit for a few days, and that tea is then added to the plants. But for us, we've found that it's just as effective to use the pellets themselves. Another area is compost, and with our soils here, we try to add organic material at the time when we plant and include that in the hole, so our plants get an opportunity. It helps with a couple of things, not only the fertility of the soil, but it'll help with water retention, and it helps the young plant, the young roots establish in that first few months of existence. Some of the other common organic materials that you see are fish emulsions. And, some of these, like with anything else, you have to be very careful and read the instruction and follow what they're saying in the containers, so you don't end up damaging the plants, even though it is something that is a fairly mild product. Mushroom compost is something that is very common in what we add to our plants in the early stages. After we've rooted them, we'll use this in the first container that we transfer them to. The seaweed and kelp extracts, they have a number of the trace elements and that we talked about before, and it's a good source for that. Manure is one that goes back in history. You see references in the early days, earlier reporting of planting roses where manure was used and how it helped. There's a couple of things that I want to just mention about using manure. One is, as they say here, is you don't want to use something that's fresh. This both horse, cow manure, for example, yeah, but especially any like your chicken manure, that can be extremely damaging to some of the tender roots on plants. But one other thing, in our area, we have to be very concerned with any of the manures that there are some herbicides that are being used on the hay fields, and the herbicides will remain in the stem of the plant and will pass through the animal and ultimately be still active in the manure. And in some instances, this will diminish and will break down in a matter of 30 or 60 days. But in some instances, they have found where it's still been present in that for up to 2 years. Now, these herbicides were designed for broadleaf weeds in that pasture, and consequently, it's something that will damage roses and vegetables. Another type of organic, considered organic, is the sewage biosolids. They're known as, like the commercial name would be millorganite. Around here, where it's known as sludge. It's one of the things, if this is used just exclusively without anything else, is this does not include any potash in the percentage of elements present or nutrients present. And usually it's in the range of a 6-4-0 or a 5-3-0 is what we see quite often with the products like this that are made available. But as it does indicate here, it may include some of the heavy metals. We talked a little bit about how here in Florida, we're able to use the slow release, the time release. The commercial first names was Osmocote, but for us, it's just a generic slow release fertilizer. This has works well for us. It does allow us to have the plant receive nourishment over an extended period of time. And these fertilizers are prepared where that there is a shell, if you will, that can be activated with different methods. And in our instance, on our bag that we use, it's a polymer that the temperature range has an effect on how quickly the exterior will break down. So we can buy 9 months, but if it stays extremely warm for a longer period of time, then it can break down more quickly. One of the big advantages, of course, of the fertilizer is that it does not reduces your chance of fertilizer burn, but for us, like I say, it doesn't just extend the time that the plant gets the nourishment over a longer period rather than using the short-term granulars. One of the cautions that they say is the one we talked about earlier. We introduce this early in the season in the spring, and then know that it's going to have spent by the time the plants want to begin their dormancy. And here, even in Florida, they still, the dormant period is important for them. This talks about too much water and nutrients being released too fast, and that is in some of these time release, the shells or the exteriors are water activated, where others are activated, as it says, by different methodologies. We talked about nitrogen as it shows up as your first component and ingredient in your fertilizers. And this particular one, this nitrate nitrogen, is the most available and fastest acting. And this is something that, again, you might want to make a note of this particular point. Another one is another type of nitrogen, and this nitrogen here is one that it changes from the ammonium, and then it converts into nitrate, which is then taken up by the plant. One of the most available today excuse me, one of the most available in use in agriculture as well as in the nursery business, it will be the presence of ureas as one of your nitrogen forms. And this is one of the slowest to be absorbed and to be available. And the final one is the nitrite, which is, it's so expensive that it's not even something that you see much in any of your research now. As a CR, you're going to be asked by folks about problems that they see with their plants. So these are some of the nutrient imbalances that are observed quite often. And as like a beginning point, just to learn what the person's describing. If you can't see it yourself or get a picture of it, then the fact that the leaves are pale yellow and then are stunted, this could be nitrogen deficiencies. Another deficiency is oxygen deficiency that has symptoms that are similar to nitrogen deficiency. So again, a point you might want to keep in mind. And in this instance, it's nitrogen, it's not adding nitrogen is not going to correct it. Usually when you see this problem, you have a problem that's related to watering or poor drainage. And this either the overwatering of the plant and could be in containers or in some of your soils. It's just doesn't have good drainage. And when you see the leaf veins show a yellowing, there's very likely problem is going to be oxygen deficiency versus nitrogen. Another nutrient problem is going to be your iron deficiency. And in these, you're going to see the areas between the veins showing yellow, while the veins of the leaf themselves remain green. So this is a good point or example for getting a good description of what the person asking for assistance is just seeing or experiencing with their roses. Now, leaf burns, this could come from many things. Here, especially with container problems, we see where a lack of water or the quick loss of water through the dehydration. You see it there, you see it with over-fertilizing, and then spray burn. That's one of the things I'm sure you'll hear more about later on with the chemicals, is that certain of the herbicides can have a direct and damaging effect to the rose, but some of the other foliar sprays that you use too could have leaf damage or cause leaf damage. You know, one of the things that we run into, it's not so much that the nutrients are not available in the soil. It's, it's the supply. They may be present, but because of that pH issue that we talked about very early on, if the pH range is off, that is going to have a negative impact on whether that plant can absorb the nutrients that it needs. Again, excellent rationale and logic to use in describing why people need to go ahead and get their pH tested early on. And then we talked about the micronutrient deficiencies that they are rarely seen, but it could be there. These your primary nutrients, when you see that the older leaves are being affected first by this problem that's described or that you're encountering, it's probably as a result of problems with the 3 primaries. And then your younger plant parts, if you have problems that those are being impacted or affected, then look to some of the minors that are missing. We talked about the not high percentages, but they could have that negative impact on the plant. So again, looking at the plant, it's not just that the plant has a problem, it's which part of it. What are the younger leaves being affected more or the older? And this addresses some of the things that I mentioned early in the beginning, that look to your CRs for advice, look to the internet, and in your local area, your colleges or universities, the ag people, they're going to be helpful in some of the problems that you may be encountering. One of the primary things, again, is test. If your pH is way off, then that's going to be one of the biggest single causes of your having problems or poor plant growth. When you have an overuse or a constant use of chemical fertilizers, and you're not the plants or the area of the ground is not getting any additional organic material, this can have a negative impact to the soil structure itself, and then an overall health of the plant. It's interesting when you go and look at the different Rosarians that have published information about their fertilizing schedules. Everybody seems to have their different ways and methods and components, but what is you see occurring in most instances is that there is a continual application of something throughout the growing season. And the common thing is, be conservative in what you add. Don't overdo it. You're gonna, cause more problems than what you would gain by the fertilizing. A good thing to remember in fertilizing is water deeply, both before and after fertilizing. We in Florida highly recommend the methods to water so that the water goes deep, so we can have the roots deeper and not surface roots. Again, helping our period of extreme heat here for the plant to get through it in a much better, easier way by having the deep roots rather than shallow. Here's an example of some of the high-tech tools used in fertilizing, and then getting the fertilizer incorporated into the beds. And this is a point that was made and discussed, and I wanted to bring it up here too, is that when you think about the numbers on that bag, the nitrogen, that first number, nitrogen promotes the growth above the ground for that rose. The second number is going to be your phosphorus. It promotes good and healthy roots. And the final one is potassium, which benefits that whole plant. So this is a kind of a little memory item that may help you in just understanding what those primary nutrients do and how they would help. I want to open it for questions. I imagine there's been some that have been placed through the course of this, and not familiar with, I haven't been able to monitor and see what they are, but hopefully I can check out and see if I'm not answering the same questions here.
All right, Art, thank you for a nice presentation. We'll now go into a 15-minute question and answer session. Please remember, if you're a consulting Rosarian candidate, to post candidate prior to asking your question. Now, if we are not able to get to your question, the response will be sent to you in an email. And if you have a comment you'd like to make, go to the chat box and add your comments there. All right. Sonia states that blossom end rot due to calcium deficiency happens in many vegetables like squash and tomatoes. Does this happen to rose blooms?
I'm sorry, I missed part of the original part of that question.
Bloom end rot due to calcium deficiency happens in many vegetables like squash and tomatoes. Does this happen to rose blooms?
You know, that's not something that I've seen as a, I've not seen that myself. I know blossom end rot with some of the fruits and the vegetables, but no, I have not seen that. Maybe Satish has got a,
Actually, blossom end rot refers to the soft fruits such as tomatoes. It doesn't have anything to do with the blooms themselves, but where the bloom attaches to the fruit. So it wouldn't be applicable to roses, even to rose hips.
thank you.
All right. Spencer says, when you say pelletized alfalfa, are you talking about alfalfa horse feed?
Correct. That's you can go to your farm stores. We have it here in a 40-pound bag, and it's the extruded pellets that kind of, it looks like the size of the rabbit food, not the big chunks like you would see. There's two different varieties. The big chunks are not what we use. We use the smaller extruded pellets.
All right. Anita has, for the long-acting fertilizers like Osmocote, would I just add it in the spring and not worry about any other fertilizers for the next 6 months? No more compost, seaweed, emulsions, etc.
This is something that I answer that in two ways. One, here at the nursery, we have hundreds of plants in the ground, so that's probably all they're going to get. But there's certain Rosarians that you'll talk to that are trying to grow roses for exhibits or for shows that are coming up. So they will supplement that time release throughout the growing season or the bloom season. And I find that for us, in our smaller plants, we will supplement that too. And by supplementing, I'm usually going with a liquid fertilizer on, sometimes it's a 2 or 3 week basis.
All right. CR candidate Pam Good would like to ask, how long should manure be aged before using it?
Again, let's talk about the type. With chicken manure, it needs to be a lot longer than others because that can be very, very hot. We raise chickens and we have horses and we have cows, and the chickens, I basically do not even try to use that for fear that it's going to be burned. It'll be too hot. What's interesting is in most of your organic fertilizers that you see sold commercially, chicken litter is usually a large component of that, and that has to, you know, usually sit for, I would say, at least a year to get that to a degree where it's not going to burn the plants. Now your cow and horse manures, again, that's a much shorter period. You can have the cow manure can be okay in 60 to 90 days.
All right, Melody Borg, a consulting Rosarian candidate. Do some fertilizers work better in certain types of soil versus others, such as clay, sand, etc.?
Again, it's the absorption of the different nutrients, and for us, we're very sandy, so I have to worry about it being leached through, where some of the heavier soils, especially very heavy in clay, that's not going to leach, and it's going to be there for a lot longer period.
All right, Sheldon, a candidate. When using a tea, is there a general formula to use? When is the best to apply it?
Well, using your alfalfa teas, or there's some people will use a manure tea, but for us, the alfalfa tea, we start applying that about the time that the roses are going to be in bloom. So they have gotten their first bit of large dose of fertilizer in the spring, and then it's usually going to be 60 to or so days later that we will start with supplementing with a drench. And as I say, with a lot of our in-ground stuff, they're not going to get that. They have got their alfalfa early in the season, but especially our container stuff, we will give them the drench or the tea.
All right, Pasquale, CR candidate. What about the molasses in the rabbit pellets attracting ants and pests?
Well, I don't use the rabbit pellets. I'm sorry, I may have misspoke. It's the shape of the pellet is all I'm talking about, as an extruded pellet, about the same size as what you would see in rabbit feed. The alfalfa pellets that we get are strictly alfalfa fiber and no other additive components.
Right, Jan, a CR candidate. What fertilizer should be used in the fall before roses go dormant?
Okay, and again, let's talk about Florida, because down here we're not going to have the winterization issues that some people further north are going to have, and not wanting their plants to have any real stimulation. What we do down here is in the fall is they will get a small amount of the sludge or the millorganite type fertilizer, but that's all they're going to get, and it's not going to be much because it's not a high nitrogen content at all.
All right, Malcolm, a candidate. When you dilute your solution, how long will it last before it starts to break down for storing purposes?
As a tea, is that what we're talking about? With the tea, what we'll brew the tea or put it in the container and let it sit for 36 hours, and much beyond that, we can't stand the smell of it. So it's going to be put out, and hopefully shortly after that 36-hour period.
All right, Jessica, CR candidate. For the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium mix, is there a generic ideal mix ratio for roses, or it's always test first?
Well, you know, again, I want to talk about Florida, because here there's kind of a rule of thumb, and that there was several different Rosarians, nursery owners, and professors here in Florida, and they came up with something that they used as a 3-1-2 ratio. So if you think about the three numbers, say if it's 3 times 5, so it's a 15, 5, 10. That would be a general 3-1-2 ratio for us here.
All right, David, a candidate. Which is better for use for soil, horse or chicken manure?
Again, I'm more always would go with the horse manure over the chicken. I'm very concerned about the how hot that chicken manure can be, and if I haven't aged it properly or mixed it properly, I could be damaging the plants. And as I was mentioning in the course of the presentation, this problem that we have here with the herbicides that are passing through the animals, I have to be cautious on both the horse and cow manure. The horse, generally, you're not going to see the problem as much because of the type of grass that they grow here. We use a coastal Bermuda that is the source of the grass that most horses get. But our other grasses for the cows, these herbicides could be used, and it could, really end up damaging the rows because of the herbicide passing through the animal and not breaking down by the time you get it as a manure.
All right. Phyllis would like to know, how would I make alfalfa tea, say in a 5-gallon bucket water, and how much alfalfa and steep for how long?
All right. Think about a cup and a half to 2 cups of pellets. You might want to just try crushing them slightly. And if you have something, a tea bag or some type of a gauze or an old sock in a 5-gallon bucket, I would let it steep for 36 hours at least. Here in the heat of the summer, maybe up there you're in a colder area, you have to go for 2 days. But once you have it steeped and ready, then I would usually put 2 cups around the base as a drench on our large in-ground plants.
All right. Jean would like to know, how long do fertilizers last on the shelf?
Well, that's a good question. If they are not compromised by water, which is one of the bigger problems, or by time, they are, I would say, and again, Satish can help me with his recollection or knowledge about this, but I wouldn't hold it over more than a year or so.
The fertilizers will last forever on your shelf, except physical condition may change a little bit. Some might absorb moisture and get solid. Other than that, the chemical itself doesn't change, so there is no expiry date on that for any reason.
Thank you.
All right. Teresa would like to know, we are unable to get bone meal for our spring mix. We are going to use fish bone meal instead. Is this a good substitute?
Well, you are, like so many of us, encountering the same problem. I had a big planting, and I could not find triple superphosphate, or bone meal. So if you have something that on its label has a high phosphorus content, if that particular product you're describing, and it should have it on the label or on the back side, describe what the percentage is, that would be what I would look for first.
All right, Eugene would like to know, does chemical fertilizers kill good bacteria in soils?
I don't know that it would kill it. Now, I've not had that particular problem here. We use both, and it's not been a detriment to us. Satish, do you have any comments on that particular point?
Yes, sir, I have a comment on that. Now, the chemical fertilizer, a lot has been written how the soil degrades by using chemical fertilizers. That has to do with when you first apply the chemical fertilizers, the bacteria will go down for just a little bit, but they'll come bouncing right back up. And as they use all the carbon in the soil, it affects the structure of the soil itself. Does that answer the question?
Yes, sir.
We have
Thank
time
you.
for one more question. Ellen would like to know, does praying to the soil to prevent weeds negatively affect roses?
No, the short answer is no. There are several of those pre-emergent herbicides that are out there, and I have not identified one that is particularly damaging. Preen is one that is used with many flowers and in all kinds of circumstances, and I've not seen or heard of it being one that does damage. We use another product that's called Freehand, but it has the same similar effect as a pre-emergent.
All right. That ends the Q&A session this morning. We'll now move on to the next program. That's Insects and Diseases by Mr. Baldo Villegas. And we have Jolene Adams who will introduce Baldo.
Yes, I'm very happy to introduce Baldo. He's a good friend of mine and a wonderful dance partner, but today he's not going to be dancing. He's going to be talking to us about fertilizers, or no, we did that, insects and diseases. And of course, he's eminently qualified because he's an entomologist. He has worked with the California agricultural communities at the state level, and I'm sure he has participated in some of the United States level discussions on pests and diseases. And the one thing that I was amazed at, the state of California had Baldo investigating a disease of roses that we were having along the Nevada border. And Baldo came up with an insect that would eat the disease organisms so that that weed wouldn't spread throughout the farmers' fields. That being said, Baldo, talk to us about integrated pest management, your rose pests, and the diseases.
Thank you very much, Elaine. First of all, I'd like to just tell you that I'm a professional entomologist. I worked for the Department of Food and Agriculture for 35 years or so. My program is a long program. There's several parts of it, IPM, beneficial insects, the rose pests, and then the rose diseases. Each one could be a 1 hour long talk. I'm going to try to cover everything in hopefully an hour. But I'd like to recommend a couple books that you might want to look at. The American Phytopathological Society has published a series of compendiums on rose diseases. They're due to publish the third edition, which is going to be a compendium of rose diseases and pests. Dr. Raymond Cloyd is one of the co-authors of this publication, and it's due to come out later on, hopefully this year. I was asked to participate on it, but I was going to be on vacation, and I declined to participate on the on some of the write-ups. but Dr. Cloyd is going to be a speaker in a webinar by the American Rose Society, I believe in March. So stay tuned for that. He's another entomologist from Kansas State University, and he's going to be talking about rose pests and hopefully talk about some of the chemicals that you can use for controlling some of the pests. In my program, I'm not going to concentrate on chemicals. I'm just going to try to use my program as a way of identifying the rose pests. The other book that I like to recommend is one by Whitney Crenshaw, and that was that's the second edition, Garden Insects of North America. This is by far the best publication on insects for the home garden. And you can get it through Amazon for very cheap price. So anyway, so that sums up my recommendations for this for my program. Now, the first part is going to be on IPM, Integrated Pest Management. Now, IPM is an environmental sound integration of all control methods to control pest populations below an economic or damaging level. Now, for the purposes of this, for the test, you should include that if whatever method you use, it should be the least disruptive method on the environment. Okay. Now, the strategies that are used in IPM, I'm going to be talking about IPM, okay, instead of integrated pest management. So if I say IPM, that's what I mean. Now, it includes prevention. That includes quarantines, and you can prevent a lot of insects or diseases from coming to your garden. Whenever I buy something from the store, from the nurseries, or I get plants from my friends, I always look at them very carefully, and if I have any doubts, I quarantine them. I have an area in my property where I put a lot of the plants that I bring from the nursery or from my friends, and then if I need to spray them or do something, then I take care of those at that time. Now, the other strategy is the pest and symptom identification. Now, this program that I'm giving is for that purpose. I'm going to show you the most important pests and diseases of roses that you should be aware of. Now, another strategy, and very important strategy, is the regular monitoring for pests in the presence of symptoms. Now, you notice that this is in red. If you see anything in red in my program, that means that if you're a candidate, you should be aware of that because it might be in your test. Okay, so you need to monitor your pests and the symptoms of diseases in your garden, so to prevent the problems from developing. And then, of course, you need to establish some kind of guideline or thresholds. In other words, you can be very tolerant, but when the damage becomes intolerable, I would recommend that you take some kind of action. No action is okay, but if you want to use a pesticide, make sure that you use the least disruptive method to the environment, because all pesticides can have an impact on beneficial insects, other organisms such as mycorrhizae in the soil, So be very careful what kind of action you decide to take. Okay, so in IPM, we talk about various methods that you use to implement your control strategies. There's a lot of cultural methods that we use in our gardens that we never thought of IPM methods. We also use mechanical and physical methods, biological, chemical. Now, I'm not going to talk about chemical control because it was already kind of covered by Craig Vorschel. However, in my talk, I'm going to suggest a few of the chemicals that some people commonly use. In my garden, I don't use any chemicals. I use some herbicides, but I don't use any fungicides or insecticides for my control methods. I base all my methods on cultural and mechanical means. So let's look at some of these methods. When you go to a nursery, always look at healthy plants. And then you should always maintain healthy plants in your garden because weakened plants can attract certain insects. Just a few days ago, my friend Jim Sproul was talking about borers on his roses, and some of these borers, were attracted to stems that were sunburned. Also, when you at the nursery, make sure that you inspect your plants and make sure that they're free of any pests and diseases. Talk to your other Rosarians in the area and find out if there are resistant varieties for certain diseases that are common to your area. And nowadays, there's a lot of plants that are disease resistant. I invite all my friends and new Rosarians into my garden to look at my roses because I have a whole bunch of them. And those are the ones that I recommend for them to buy. When you plant your roses, always choose the planting site. And I'm going to tell you later on as to why I recommend this. I like to make sure that the garden has at least 6 hours of sunlight. I want to make sure that there's no trees anywhere near the rose garden, and so forth. And then, of course, I make sure that I provide plenty of space to the plants. Fertilization, we already talked about that. Too much or too little will affect the plants. And sanitation is extremely important. Right now, I'm in the middle of pruning my garden, and I make sure that all the old leaves are thrown in the dumpster because I don't want any black spot in my garden later on in the season. And of course, watering methods are very, very important. Okay. Then in the mechanical controls, you can use barriers. For instance, for slugs and snails, copper banding around the base of a tree serves the purpose because whenever snails and slugs go over the copper, they get zapped. Mulching, that's for preventing weed control, weeds, and also conserve water. Solarization of the soil is very important. If you have aphids, you can just blast them with water from the hose. And then henbaking and crushing, that's what I use a lot in my garden. And I'm going to show you some methods. I use a lot. I have a lot of hose in my garden for weed control, and I try not to use any herbicides anywhere near my roses, because I even whenever I use pre-emergence herbicides such as Spring, which was mentioned earlier on, I make sure that after I spread the Preen, I water, I mist the roses with water so that any granules are washed off the roses. And then, of course, trapping. You can use sticky traps for certain pests, pheromone traps, etc. Now, this is what I do the best. I use, I squish, I'm a squisher. This is caterpillars, and you can show I'm showing you the technique that I use. I just put it between my fingers and I squish until I see the poop in the in the bottom picture. And then, but be very careful what kind of insects you squish, because some time ago I squished a brown marmorated stink bug when I was visiting my friend Marcy Martin in Connecticut. And boy, was I surprised. Anyway, some of these stink bugs can emit a very stinky odor. So be very careful. Another method that you can use your shoe, you can use some, whatever you use, it works really well. And that's the most common method that I use for controlling pests, squishing. Okay, as far as biological control, and I work in biological control for 35 years with the state of California. In biological control, we use parasitic insects and wasps. We call them parasitoids because unlike parasitic, regular parasitic insects, parasitoids kill the host. A regular parasite like a louse never kills its host. We depend on parasitic flies and wasps to releasing, for specific insects, and they control the pest. We also release predators such as ladybugs, lady beetles, lacewings, predatory mites, etc. Oops. And then, of course, we also depend on certain diseases, fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, and virus diseases. Later on, I'm going to show you milky spore for Japanese beetle control. We depend on beneficial nematodes. In the past, I used certain virus diseases for controlling insects that were devastating the grape industry in California. So I have a lot of experience in biological control. Now, what is a good biocontrol agent? A good biocontrol agent is one that has a very narrow host range. They're highly specific on the pest that you're trying to control. They're good searchers. In other words, they zero in on the host niche, and then they get the pest. And then they're able to keep the pest population under acceptable levels. Now, let's look at some of the insects that I recommend. Now, for the purpose of this talk, these are all natural enemies, okay? Because I don't use any pesticides and any fungicides, I have a lot of beneficial insects in my roses. This is a very important one. This is the minute pyrebug. I love this insect because it goes after the eggs of a lot of insects and spider mites. And it's available commercially, but again, if you don't spray chemicals, you're going to have them in your garden. They're very tiny. Another one that you can buy is the green lacewings. And again, you can buy them, and you can put the pupae in the garden, and then the adults emerge from there, and then the eggs, the adults lay their eggs near the pest problem, and then they start consuming the pest. This is on the right, on the left hand, you see the eggs on those silken strands. They look like nets. And then the larvae, they look like tiny crocodiles with huge mandibles. And then they grab the pest and they suck it dry and they kill it. And then, of course, one of the natural enemies that is very, very important in my garden in the spring are the leatherwing beetles. These beetles are responsible for clearing the aphids in my garden. When I see these beetles in the first week in March through actually in the month of March, I know that those aphids are going to be under control. I call them the silver bullet in my garden. And then, of course, I have lots and lots of lady beetles. I don't recommend buying any of these natural enemies because if you don't spray, they will stay in your home and they will be there to take care of the problem. Right now, I'm finding a lot of lady beetles in my garden, even though it's in the middle of the winter, and they're in my garden. I don't have to buy them. This lady beetle right here, this is a fungus-feeding beetle, and again, it feeds on powdery mildew. So if you don't spray, they're out there helping you in the garden. And then, of course, a lot of people give a lot of credit to praying mantises. Are they really beneficial insects? They're predators, but they're lazy predators. I don't recommend anybody buying them because they just kind of sit pretty on the flowers of roses, and they wait for insects to come over, and they don't care what kind of insect it is. They love honeybees. So as a result of that, I don't allow any praying mantises in my garden. I have a lot of crab spiders in my garden, and they're kind of neat because they hide between the petals, and they grab anything that comes around the petals. This is what I do in my garden. I provide my garden with lots and lots of perennial plants that would attract beneficial insects. And then around the periphery of my, or the edges of some of this English garden, I have a lot of single petal roses. Single petal roses are fantastic roses because they attract a lot of beneficial insects. So I keep a lot of perennial plants to attract the beneficial insects and keep them in my garden. And my favorite plant is the yarrows, and also a few of the other plants like this that produce umbels of flowers. And then you can see honeybees and predaceous wasps in there. And the predaceous wasp will go after grasshoppers and katydids and other insects that might be in the garden. Okay, so let's look at some of the common pests. The first pest that you're going to see in your garden are the aphids. And this is you can see this is a huge infestation. And this is where I go in there with with water from the hose, and I blast them off the buds. I usually blast a lot of the aphids off the buds like this because I don't want any aphids building up. And then you can see that the aphids, they can multiply within a week's time. They can go from one generation to the next. This mature aphid is giving birth to a living aphid. a living embryo. So they can multiply very, very fast. A lot of the sucking insects give off a residue called honeydew. And ants love honeydew. In fact, ants will farm the aphids and other insects, and they move them from one plant to another. So if you see ants in your garden and you see this honeydew, most likely there you have an infestation of some kind of sucking insect. And then, of course, if you have sooty molds on top of the leaves, that's definitely another indication that you have a sucking insect somewhere in the plant. Scale insects. Now you can see that it's in red. Scale insects don't look anything like an insect. They're round. They kind of look like something from the sea. Anyway, but under that cover, you can see the actual insect, and in the picture on the right, you can see a female with a lot of nymphs, and those nymphs will move just a few millimeters away from the plant, from the mother, and then they clamp down, and then they continue the infestation. You can see in this slides that what happens. There's a lot of immature scale insects side by side here, and when you get to this point, you need to do something. And some of my friends call me up with pictures like this, and I recommend some kind of oil spray on a regular basis, and it might take several applications of horticulture oils to control these scale insects. This is another scale. This I found it in, I believe, in Hawaii, but you can see that the little tiny scales, they're building up for an infestation. And this is another sample of scales that I found in Florida when I was visiting my friends in Florida. And then spider mites is another sucking insect, another sucking organism. It's a small spider, and they give off silk. And you can see that you usually find them on the underside of the leaves, and they suck the leaves from the underside, and they can build up in tremendous numbers, especially when it gets pretty hot. In my previous garden, right next to the sidewalk, in the month of May, that's when I used to see the spider mites building up. And you can see this damage. This is very typical damage of spider mites. And you never want to get to this point. You want to take action before it gets to this point. What I was able to do is I was able to rig up some kind of drip irrigation system where I was able to put them underneath, draw the hoses underneath the bushes, and then each bush would get a misting from the underside of the bush, and I was able to control the spider mites just with water being emitted from the undersides. And this is a typical infestation of spider mites. You can see the webbing, and then this is the two spider mite. And if you turn the leaves over, that's what I do a lot when I'm diagnosing a problem. I turn the leaves over, and then if I see the webbing on the undersides, then I know that you have an infestation of spider mites. Now, thrips, they're they are a difficult problem to deal with. They're very tiny insects. They have this feather wings. They're very, very tiny. They have rasping, sucking mouth parts, and they fly a little bit, not too long, not too far, but they can be carried long distances by winds. In fact, these winds and the hurricanes in the Caribbean and South is to blame for the introduction of chili thrips into Florida back in the early 2000s. You can see this is a sample that I took from a flower, and you can see that in the sample you see immature thrips as well mature thrips. And again, they're very, very tiny. They're about 1/8 of an inch long. So you have to squint to see them. And this is the life cycle of a typical thrips. They go 4 instars. And the first one is the most damaging one, the first and the second one. And then when they get to the 3rd instar, called the prepupa, they kind of lay dormant. And then for the next 2 instars, they kind of don't do anything. And then from there, an adult comes out. And then the cycle starts all over. The adults may lay their eggs, they may insert their eggs in tissue on the petals or on the tissue of the roses. Now, flower thrips. Now you notice that it's in red. Flower thrips make this distinct trails on petals of roses, especially in light color roses. And again, they're think of flower thrips just like a rototiller with a suction mechanism, and they go through the petals and they cause a lot of this trailing, this damage that looks like trails. Okay, and this is a very typical damage of flower thrips. Okay, then the other pest that is very important in the southern part of the U.S. From Florida all the way to California, Southern California, is chili thrips. Chili thrips was first discovered in Florida around 2005 or so. My friend from Cool Roses, he was the one that sounded the alarm. He took some specimens to the ag station in Florida. They didn't pay attention to him. He sent me the samples, and then I identified them as chili thrips. And anyway, so that was in around 2005. And then from there, it took several years for the chili thrips to move from Florida across the South into Texas. And then in 2015, we found it in California. And again, I was able to identify it in California around July of 2015. It has a huge host range. It has over 112 host plants, and probably more. Literally anything that's green would be a host plant. And they're extremely tiny. If I told you that a regular flower thrips is 1/8 of an inch, this is about maybe 1/64 of an inch. So they're very, very tiny. And they love the hot weather. They're a problem in the summer months. Okay, you can see in this slide that at temperatures of 61 degrees, it takes 40 days to complete the life cycle. But at 95 degrees, it takes only 11 days to complete the life cycle. So in California, we start seeing those temperatures in the month of May. So, so if you're in those areas that gets really hot, you might have this problem, especially in the southern parts of the U.S. And now, chili thrips. One of the best methods to identify it is by the scarring of the undersides of the leaves, like this. You can see this scarring, and that's due to the feeding damage of the thrips. Okay. The other way you can identify them is by this damage to the new growth of roses. This is new growth, tender new growth that looks like rat tails. They're long, and then the foliage is distorted, and oftentimes the bloom is also distorted. And again, the stem, the bud, and the undersides of the leaves are totally scarred and brown. So these are typical diagnostic characters of to diagnose chili thrips. And my friend Lance Osborne, who was one of my colleagues when I was a graduate student at UC Davis, he's the leading authority on chili thrips. Some time ago, he published this chart in his website showing avid and conserve of spinosad as probably the most effective. And then my friend Katie Vellegas down in Southern California swears by orthene or acephate or controlling chili thrips. So anyway, you can see that these are some of the methods that they use. Now, last week, there was a question on an organic material for controlling chili thrips, and that's spinosad. Okay, and spinosad is sold in the box stores and nurseries under different labels. I've been using the one from Monterey Chemical Company, but there are other brands out there. Captain Jack's is another brand. Anyway, there's about 4 different brands that I have seen in the markets. Now, going on to chewing insects, grasshoppers, especially longhorn grasshoppers, are very, very common in gardens. Katydids, which is the most common one, loves new growth, and I generally see the feeding damage of these grasshoppers on new growth. And then when I see it, then I look for them very carefully. And once I find them, then I grab them and I squish them. But you can see that the nymphs or the immature parts of the grasshopper, they don't look anything like the adults. Anyway, and then the grasshopper lays their eggs either on the leaves or on the stems. This is another species of katydid that lays its eggs on the stems, and they look like lentils stacked on each other. Now, if you're on the East Coast, your biggest problem would be Japanese beetles. Dr. Cloyd probably will address this control methods for Japanese beetles when he gives his program in March. But Japanese beetles can be very common from June all the way into September. Whenever I visit the Yankee District in Connecticut and Massachusetts, I see them in people's gardens, and that's usually in September. But you can see that they love a lot of stuff that's green. They love roses. They love grapevines. Certain trees are totally defoliated by the Japanese beetles. And then the larvae, the beetles lay their eggs in starting in July, August, in the ground, and then the larvae feed on the roots of grasses. One of the methods that can be used to control Japanese beetle is through the organic material called milky spore. It's a disease, it's a bacterial disease, and that's what I would use in the area for long-term control, and then I would do a lot of squishing and also dropping the beetles in soapy water so that I can dry them. In my area, one pest that is very similar to Japanese beetle is the Hapia beetle, and this one emerges from the ground in the months of March, and it goes into May, and then after 6 weeks in any one area, you never see him again until the following year. Rose curculio can be found in many areas of the country, and again, this one is a spring pest. It loves the new buds that are produced in the spring. The adults have this beak, this long snout, and with that they make holes on the buds, and then the females turn around and they lay their eggs in some of those holes that they make, and then the larvae will feed on the inside petals and into the seeds of the developing seeds of the rose. Again, my method of controlling is through squishing. Caterpillars, they're oftentimes they're kind of hard to detect because they blend with the stems or the leaves of the rose. You can see this larva that you find in the fall months of the year or in the spring months of the year, and it's very difficult to detect because it blends with the stems of the rose. This little caterpillar right here at the base of this leaf, again, is very difficult to detect, but I can find it because of the fresh damage that it caused on this rose. And I was over at my friend Saki Vellegas a few years back, and she was telling me that she couldn't find these caterpillars. So then we looked for fresh damage, and then I was able to find the little larvae on the underside of the leaves toward the base. Now, the leaf rollers can be found throughout the country, and this is the most common one that I used to have in my garden. It used to be my #1 problem in the spring because I had a lot of trees around my property right next to my rose garden, and the caterpillars would come down in silken strands, and then they would go into the tips of my roses, and then they would tie the buds with silk, and then construct a feeding hole, a nest. And so I used to have to dress up, completely, and then spray, real nasty chemicals, and in order to control it. Well, when I bought this new property, I make sure that I didn't have any host plants anywhere near the rose garden. And this is why location is very, very important for your rose garden. If you have trees that have certain pests that will feed also on roses, then you have a problem. And this is why when I bought this property, I located the rose garden away from any host trees. There are some tiny moths, very, very tiny moths that can be miners, and these are leaf miners, that you find on the foliage. This is a pest that I find throughout the country, and there's also a pest that you find. There's another species of moth that you find on the stems, and this is not as common across the country. It's mainly a problem that I see in California, but you'll be surprised how many pictures I get about this insect from California people. And I tell them that it's just cosmetic damage. They're not doing anything major to the stems. Now this is all damage from this stem miner, and when I see something like this, I just kind of prune the stem off, and problem solved. Now I put down snails here because a lot of the feeding damage by snails can be confused for damage by caterpillars and grasshoppers or any chewing insect. But you can recognize that because snails and slugs leave a silvery trail because of the slime. And again, what I do for this pest is I use there are some baits that you can use, and that's what I use. Now, in the East Coast, you have a pest called the rose midge. And rose midge, we don't have it in California. We had an infestation in California, but it was treated, and it never got to be a major pest in California. But it is in the East Coast, and it's also in the Pacific Northwest. There has been some research done on this, and it seems like soil insecticides is one of the methods that works the best, but it has to be applied right at the right time when the midges are starting to emerge from the soil. And for that, I recommended using some sticky traps near the soil, and so that you can identify the midges as they emerge from the soil, and then go ahead and treat the soil for rose midge. Anyway, so you can see that this is not rose midge. This is another similar insect. I use this insect for biological control of a weed, but it's a similar insect, and you can see that they're very, very tiny. Okay, about 1/8 of an inch long. You have to squint a lot to see it. And these are pictures that I took when I was visiting my friends in Connecticut. And you can see the larvae on the left-hand side, tucked away, and I've seen as many as 12 larvae right there at the tip of the near at the base of the bud. And what the larvae do is that they feed on the tissue, and then basically they kill the bud. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the bud is now it looks like a burnt tip. And oftentimes, a lot of people don't recognize this. So if you go to a garden and you don't see any flowers, but you see all these dead tips, that's an indication that you might have rose midge as a problem. Rose slugs or rose sawflies can be a big problem in certain areas. In California, we see this pest very commonly in the coastal areas in California, but I have seen this same pest in the East Coast and other parts of the country. There are several species of rose slugs. but it seems like the bristly rose slug is the most common. And this is the bristly rose slug, and you can see this why it's called the bristly rose slug. On the right-hand side, you can see that this larva has a lot of bristles. And you can see on the left-hand side, you see the typical damage of this pest. And then there's another one. This one, I call this one the European rose slug, or it's also common. It's also called the common rose slug. And this one has only one generation per year. And you can see that the larva doesn't look anything like the bristly rose slug. Mainly feeds on the top of the leaf, that is instead of the bottom of the leaf, like the bristly rose slug. The bristly rose slug has up to 5 generations in California. This other sawfly used to be a big problem in my other garden because I used to grow a lot of boysenberries. But in my present garden, I hardly see any damage. I don't know why, but in certain areas it can be a problem, but not in others. So just be aware that you might have certain pests in your garden. Cane borers. Cane borers are, generally the ones that I find across the country are caused by wasps, predaceous wasps, and regular bees. Bees are not predaceous, just the wasps. And the wasps are beneficial insects. And in this case, the one on the left is a predator of aphids. So generally, when I see canes like this, I know that the beneficial insects are working. They're not impacting the rose garden a lot. They just boring in the pith, and they're not causing any damage to the stems. Okay, so I let them be. I don't cut them back during the season, but when I'm pruning, I might cut the I might prune those canes off. Okay. So again, for the purpose of the CR school, cane borers are, they're caused by bees and wasps tunneling through the stems. And then lastly, leafcutter bees can be a problem in certain areas of the country, especially in agriculture areas where there's where they have alfalfa growing for seed or for grain. And this is a leafcutter bee. It's called the alfalfa leafcutter bee. And you can see the dynastic damage that they do to the roses. On the edges of the roses, of the rose leaves, they have this oval cuts, and they use that material for nesting purposes. Now, I'm only going to concentrate on rose diseases that are most common in our rose gardens. I thank Dr. Mark Winham for the use of some of his slides and pictures, and he's in the background. He's going to be listening to me, and also anybody that has any questions on rose diseases, he will be answering some of the questions in the background. So I thank him very highly. He's a great friend, known him for many, many years. And anyway, so when we're talking about rose diseases, you have to have 3 things. You have to have a susceptible plant, the rose. You have to have an available pathogen, the disease pathogen, and you have to have the favorable environmental conditions. And then, of course, over time for the disease to develop. Okay, So those are the three things in the triangle. Okay, so first let's talk about environment, abiotic disease-like symptoms. Okay, what are those things that are not a disease? Now, there are physiological problems, and we talked about some of those due to pesticides, due to nutrition imbalances. If you drown your plants with water, you can have some problems in the foliage and the stems that will look like a disease. pH imbalance can also cause some symptoms in the foliage and stems. You can have environmental streams, too hot, too cold. If you park your car right next to a exhaust pipe, you're going to have some air pollutants. And then, of course, pesticide injury like Roundup. And believe me, I get a lot of pictures of Roundup damage in the rose garden of people that don't realize that they're using a Roundup right next to the roses, and is going to cause some problems. And of course, drainage problems. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you can see that this is a nutritional damage, nutritional symptom caused by probably iron deficiency. The central picture is probably due to lack of water. In other words, the pot was not watered. And then on the right-hand side is that rose was sprayed with Roundup, or it was right next to the walkway, and the person that was spraying Roundup right next to the walkway to the roses didn't realize that there was drift into the rose. And this is a huge problem. This person actually probably sprayed this rose, or sprayed the area near this rose, very close to this rose, and then the Roundup drifted by vapor action or by wind to this rose. So this is a very typical damage by Roundup. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the organisms that cause diseases. Nematodes, bacteria, fungi, and viruses. Nematodes attack the roots, and these are the nodules that you can see with certain nematodes, such as dagger root knot nematode. And there are some others, dagger nematodes, lesion root knot, just like the one that I show you, and there's some others. And then, of course, crown gall. Now, crown gall can be a gall-like material that you can find around the crown of the rose, right next to where you prune your rose, around near the soil level, in the roots, or up in the stems where you have the pruning cuts. And this is a crown gall on the roots of this rose right here. Okay, so for those that are taking the test, be aware that crown gall is caused by a bacteria. And again, it enters through a wound. And again, the wound can be caused by the pruning, grafting, or mechanical injury by tools. So be aware of that. Now, what are the controls for crown gall? First of all, you buy disease-free plants. You examine the plant roots, especially if you're buying bare root roses. if you see any galls on the roots or on the crown, stay away from that variety because most likely all those plants of that variety are infected with the bacteria. If you already bought a potted plant, what I do in my garden is I do not plant any roses in my garden because all new roses go into a quarantine area, and I hold them for 6 months because I want to make sure that there's no crown gall in those roots. And I have seen crown gall develop over the 6 months after I bring them into my garden. Avoid injury to the roots and crown stems while planting or cultivating. Well, if you're potting up berry roses, make sure that you buy properly treated mulch, plant potting mix. What I do in my garden, when I'm pruning my roses, like at this time of the year, if I detect crown gall in some of those roses, I remove the plant immediately, and I just kind of I don't plant anything in that area for a long time. I have some areas in my garden that where I discovered crown gall, and I haven't planted anything in that area for at least 5 years. If you remove the gall, it might come back. So it might work temporarily, but it might come back. Always sterilize your pruning tools, and even if I touch anything that has crown gall, I spray Lysol into my gloves and to my tools, and because I don't want to spread it to other plants in my garden. In the past, there were a couple of biological antagonists that were available for commercial purposes. That was Gallex and Galtrol. Gallex was an emulsion that was applied directly to the bush, to the area after you remove the crown gall. And the other one was Galtrol. Is a culture live bacteria. And what you do is that you buy the petri dishes with a Galtrol, and then you dissolve in a 5-gallon bucket, and then you dip your bedroot roses in there. And I saw some research back in the 80s where they did it for walnut seedlings, and they had a very good success. Now, I don't know what the status of these products are, but if you're interested, you can do an internet search and see if they're still available. Okay, so we're gonna go into fungal diseases. Now, these are some general control considerations, and I'm going to be repeating some of these things again and again and again because they're going to be showing up in some of the CR tests later on in the when you take the test. Okay, so first of all, if they are resistant varieties, make sure that you buy those. And there are many resistant varieties to things like powdery mildew. Some of the knockout roses are resistant to some varieties of black spot, but anyway, I'll cover that later on. I invite people over to my garden to look at my garden, and then I recommend those varieties that, in my opinion, are disease resistant to my area. And what I do in my garden is when I when I'm going through my garden to, as a monitoring, in the mornings when I go and I do my monitoring, if I see any problem that I see in the garden, I immediately take care of it, by pruning and getting rid of the infected plant material in the trash can. When I plant my roses, I make sure that I have a good spacing between the roses. I plant my roses at least 4 feet away from the other roses. In some of the shrubs, I go even further out because they can be big, very big. When I prune my roses, I make sure that the center is open, and because you want to provide the rose with good ventilation, because that prevents some of the fungal diseases. Again, avoid overhead irrigation with sprinklers, especially in the evening hours. If you're going to do that, do it early in the morning so that the the leaves are able to dry. And this is very important for some of the diseases that I'm going to be covering. Sterilize your tools. And again, I use Lysol. In the past, I used to use Clorox, but I got tired of having spotted pants because Clorox will do that to your pants and your clothing. And then I make sure that all my tools are very sharp. If I crush the stems while I'm pruning, I recut and make sure that the cut is good. And then I just avoid doing any injury to my rose canes. If I'm weeding right next to my roses, I tell my gardener to stay away from with the weed eater anywhere near the rose garden, okay? And right next to the rose garden, I do all the weeding manually to avoid any injury to the roses. Now, the first disease that I'm going to cover is black spot. And this is a very typical picture of black spot in my area. You can see the round spots with feathery edges on the spots, and then oftentimes the leaves or the leaflets turn yellow and drop. So if you have a severe infestation of black spot, you're going to have severe defoliation. Now, for the ideal conditions for black spot is that the spores of the conidia have to be immersed in water for at least seven hours continuously, and it needs the free water or the free moisture. The other thing about black spot, the spores, so conidia, they overwinter in infected leaves, fallen leaves, and on stems. In California, we don't get a severe winter like in the East Coast, so we still have a lot of plants that hold their leaves during the winter. So if I see any leaves with black spot, I make sure that I remove all those leaves. So when I finish pruning, all my roses are naked. There's no leaves left on those roses, because I want to make sure that I don't contribute to an infestation. Then I go in there with a leaf blower, and I make sure that all the beds are clean of previous year's foliage. And by doing this, I avoid a severe infestation of black spot. Now, there's a lot of work that's being done right now with resistance, disease resistant in roses. Dave Slesak at Wisconsin University is doing a lot of work with them, and Dr. Winham is cooperating with him, testing disease resistant for black spot as well as rose rosette. Anyway, now there's a series of roses called the knockout roses, and they're supposed to be disease resistant to black spot. In California, we're not seeing that. We've seen some infection by black spot in California. We also see that knockout roses are disease susceptible to powdery mildew and to rust. So just because some roses are called disease resistant, it doesn't mean that they're disease resistant to all the fungi. So, but in the East Coast, I've been to many places where the knockout roses look beautiful, whereas the other roses are totally foliated. So knockout roses are great in some areas, but not necessarily in others. What I do is I promote good air circulation and row spacing in the garden. And then I keep the foliage dry as possible during the evening hours. I water early in the morning so that the leaves have a chance to dry. And then the regular fungicidal sprays may be needed to keep as preventative of this disease control method. Now, powdery mildew is caused by Sperotheca, and is diagnosed as this powdery material called that you can see in this slide. This is a very susceptible variety. Now, the powdery material is fungal growth that you can find on the leaves, in the stems, and into the buds of the rose. The young tissue is the most susceptible. So in my garden, I usually see powdery mildew in the spring, on the new growth, and in susceptible varieties. And the powdery mildew causes the leaves, the stems, and the buds to twist and be distorted. So that's the way I identify it. What I do is I usually prune all those areas, and personally I avoid some of the older varieties of roses because they are very susceptible to a lot of fungal diseases. So I don't have any of the older varieties of roses in my garden. I have a few of the exhibition roses, but boy, I tell you, every year I have to be very tolerant on some of these diseases on these older varieties. Now, the cool nights with high humidity favors the spore germination and infection, whereas the warm days with low humidity favor spore formulation. And the fungus overwinters in the leaves, stems, and buds. And again, as I prune my roses right now, if I see any powdery mildew growing on any of the stems or any of the parts of the plant, I usually prune it out. Wind is very, very important in the in promoting powdery mildew from infested plant to nearby plants. And you can see in this slide on the right-hand side, those are overwintering stems that I took out in my garden. And you can see that it's right next to the prickles. On the left-hand side is a spring picture of one of my red roses, and you can see that you can see the powdery mildew on the peduncle and on the leaves. So good sanitation is a good control method for powdery mildew. I remove anything that looks infested. Again, I promote good air circulation by providing all my roses with good spacing between the roses. I try to get as many of the disease-resistant varieties. My Dick Clark rose is one of those that doesn't get any disease whatsoever. I love it. So this is one of the ones that I highly recommend for people. And then, of course, if you have some of the old varieties, you might have to spray preventatively to keep the disease under control. Rust. Rust is mainly common in the West Coast. It's very common in California in some of the old varieties. And rust can be detected by the golden spores or pustules on the underside of the leaves, like this. You can see that in the left hand. On the top of the leaves, you can see a yellow spot like that. Some varieties of rust will have the pustules on the top of the leaves and on the stems. But the one that is very common in my garden doesn't do that. Now, in the winter, the rust spores are black, and that's because it has a thickened cell wall, and that's to be able to withstand the cold weather. Okay, that's for survival of the spores. And again, the optimal conditions is rust loves cool weather and lots of moisture for at least 4 hours. It needs the free moisture. I work with several rust diseases on weeds for biological control, and we used to release this rust along the coast because those were the optimal conditions for the rust to work. Okay. What I do is you might have to use protecting fungicides to protect your roses if they are susceptible to rust. And again, I don't see it very often because I got rid of most of the ones that were susceptible. But avoid the wetting of the leaves, especially during the evening hours, and pick off some of the lower leaves near the ground. Again, practice good sanitation, and that would be my recommendation. Now, downy mildew. I got acquainted with downy mildew a long time ago when I first started growing roses in the early 80s, and nobody could tell me what it was until a friend of mine was able to diagnose it as downy mildew. And in 1983, the compendium rose diseases came out, and I remember reading the compendium from cover to cover, and then I learned more about downy mildew. And at that time, it was considered, well, a lot of people mistook it for black spot. But black spot differs from downy mildew because, you know, we talked about the feathery edging on the on black spot, whereas downy mildew, the blotches are purplish to blackish, and then the edges usually are angled, and they follow a leaf vein usually. But the main thing is that they don't have the feathery edging, okay? And then oftentimes that they're purplish in color. Usually it's a spring disease, usually, and they love the humidity, the cool conditions, and also the moisture. So if you have in those conditions, you can have downy mildew in your area. It's a big problem in greenhouses, but you know, most of us don't grow greenhouse roses, so we don't have to discuss that here. Again, methods of controlling is open up the centers of your roses for good ventilation, avoid overhead watering during the cool season, and as preventative fungicides, you can use Aliette. If you don't want hard chemicals, you can use a product called Agrifos from Monterey Chemical Company, and it's actually a fertilizer. You can use there's also other chemicals such as Mansate, Mancozeb, that also provide. Those are contact type of fungicides. And these are pictures of downy mildew, and you can see in the first picture, if you know the purplish spot, you know, follows the leaf vein, and then and you can see on the right hand side, you can see the purple spots, and in the bottom left, you can see the angling of the spots, and then downy mildew, you find it on, you know, internally in the, you know, intercellular in the leaves and in the stems, but it sporulates, and then the fruiting bodies come through the openings of the stomata, and then if you fold the leaf like this, like in the bottom right, you can see the little stomata, I mean the little fruiting bodies protruding from the stomata. And then if you put those in a microscope, you can see it very clearly. And that's usually how I identify downy mildew. This is another picture of downy mildew. And botrytis, very difficult disease to control. And basically, when I first started growing roses, my friends used to tell me that those little spots on the petals were spotting because of the water spots. And yes, the water spot, but those are where the lesions of the spores are starting. And then the lesions get bigger and bigger, and then pretty soon the whole petal is infected, and then pretty soon the whole bloom is infected. So when I see this, when I see the symptoms, I immediately start cutting the blooms of the rose to avoid a huge infestation of botrytis. My friends in the East Coast that are exhibitors, usually have some kind of bonnet on the right next to the rose. They put her over the rose to protect it from the rain, and then that's how they can get away from an infestation of botrytis in their gardens. And I first saw this back in 2009 when I visited my friend Gian Maria, and he had hundreds of these bonnets right next to the rose garden. Okay, it's a very difficult fungus to control. Canker, we also call it dieback. It's another fungal disease. It's caused by generally starts at pruning cuts, and then the microorganism comes in. It's mainly a winter disease, a cool weather disease, and you can see that you have these blackened areas of the tip of the cut stems. And anyway, what I do is I practice strict sanitation in my garden. When I see canker, I just cut it off. Now, it's very difficult to control it through existing fungicides. In fact, I don't recommend the use of fungicides for that because they're worthless. I just go with strict sanitation. And then if I cut into any infected material, I quickly sterilize my tools. And then I make sure that all my tools are very sharp. Okay, there are two spotted diseases. The anthracnose is mainly in the West Coast, and it's mainly in cool weather, and requires some moisture. And again, because I defoliate all my roses, I don't carry this disease into my spring time. In fact, I hardly ever see it in my rose garden. I have to go to remote areas in the East Coast. I mean, in the coastal areas of California to take pictures of them because I don't see it in my garden. But in my travelings through the East Coast, I run into this problem, Cercospora leaf spot. And again, this is mainly a problem where you have the hot, humid weather, and it's very similar to anthracnose, and it's very difficult to control. Supposedly the control methods they use for black spot will control that, but a lot of my friends do not use any fungicides, so I don't see it very often. The last disease I'm going to cover is rose mosaic and the viruses. And rose mosaic is a complex of viruses, and you can see that it has a lot of symptoms on the foliage. The symptoms are variable. You have these chlorotic spots, you have green spots, you have mottling, and then you even have flower break. You mainly see it in the spring, where the symptoms are very clear, and then but in the summer when it's hot, the symptoms are masked. You can't see the rose mosaic very well. The rose mosaic is transmitted through vegetative propagation, and where infected plant material is butted onto or grafted onto scions or rootstocks. Anyway, that's the way you get rose mosaic. And again, this is a complex of viruses. And this is some of the symptoms that you see for rose mosaic. We commonly just call it rose mosaic. We knowing that this is because of virus. Okay. Okay. The other disease that I'm going to cover is rose rosette disease. And Dr. Wyndham is online in case that somebody decides to ask some questions about rose rosette. Rose rosette is been in the area for many years. I started following rose rosette in 1978 when I found it in extreme northern California, and but you can see that from these slides, you get this type of growth. It's sort of like a medusa type growth, whereas the leaflets are totally distorted, and you get a lot of bunching of the, and then you get also severe thorniness in the stems. The disease is vectored by a group of blister mites. And I think Dr. Wyndham has discovered other species of blister mites that also transmit it. But this used to be the one that I used to follow, Phallocoptis fructifilus. Anyway, the early symptoms are, as you can see from this from the slide from Dr. Mark Wyndham's program, is you have the flower buds are misshapen. You have distorted sepals, strap leaves, and increased thorniness. Now, I used to identify it because of the increased thorniness. I also used to identify it because the internodal space was very close. Okay. Now, a lot of people mistake Roundup damage for rose rosette, and you'll be surprised how many times I have corrected people that claim that they had rose rosette, when in fact it was Roundup damage. And you can see that Roundup damage is totally different. The leaves are distorted and light to white green, and then are, you know, the affected leaves are in bunches like that. Okay. Also, the internodal spaces are much bigger or much longer. And you can see in this slide the effects that in a few years, if you don't do something with the plant, that plant will eventually die. Dr. Wyndham recommends that as soon as you see it, you take care of it. If you you need to monitor your garden very carefully, and as soon as you start seeing the symptoms of the disease, you know, the thorniness, the red foliage, you rogue that plant, you dig it out, and you take it out and you put it in a bag, a plastic bag, and you dump it in the trash can or you burn it. Don't drag it through your garden, okay? If you wait too long, it's too late. By that time, the mites could have gotten to other parts of the plant. And this is what Mark recommends, is that you bag the plant right there and then you bag it, and then destroy the plant either by tossing it in the trash can or burning it, if you can burn it. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Villegas, for a wonderful program. We'll now go into a 15-minute verbal question and answer session. Remember, if you are a CR candidate, indicate candidate and then ask your question. Stuart Dalton would like to know what companion plants attract parasitic wasps and flies.
Any of the what I do is I put a lot of yarrows in my garden. A lot of the flowering plants also attract, a lot of the perennials that are out there also attract them. If you notice in my slide, I use a lot of single petal roses around around the margins of my garden, because the beneficial insects, they want to have access to the nectar and pollen, so they can lay their eggs, they can produce eggs, and like circuit flies are the first ones that come out. They need that extra energy, and a lot of the insects, they have to feed on the pollen to produce eggs. So I just go to the nurseries, and then I just kind of scan all the flowering plants that they have, and anything that attracts beneficials, I buy it, and then I try it. So I have a list of about 20 or 30 plants that I use in my garden, and maybe I'll post it on the website for the American Rose Society later on.
All right. Candidate Craig England would like to know what sort of beneficial insects are recommended for thrip control.
Well, the main thing that I recommend is stop treating, because as I mentioned before, insecticides and fungicides impact beneficial organisms, either beneficials, insects, mites, or mycorrhizae in the soil. So I love the small pirate bugs. That's the one that I highly value in my garden. But again, they come in. If you stop spraying, they will show up. You also show a lot of leatherwing beetles or solia beetles will also show up, and they will clean up your aphids. A lot of the lady beetles will also show up, and they will also help you in the garden. So those are the three that you can really see. Eventually, you'll get other insects such as green lacewings show up. And again, I don't recommend buying this stuff. If you stop spraying, they will come.
All right, Michelle Lynch, a CR candidate, would like to know how to sterilize soil for crown gall.
You can't. You cannot sterilize the soil. It's very frustrating when I go to people's garden and they tell me that they dumped a gallon of Clorox in the soil to sterilize the soil. I don't recommend it. What I was reading Dr. Mark Winham, his writings on rose diseases, and he recommends to remove as much of the soil as you can. and then put a couple bushels of new soil in there, then plant your roses. Dr. Mark Winham is in the background. Maybe he can tell us. Mark, do you have any suggestions?
Well, as far as crown gall goes, the only thing that might work for a sterilization thing would be to take the rose bed out of production for 2 years. If you are in a environment that has a long growing season, you could till the soil up, wet it real good, put plastic on it, solarize it. The next year, till it again, wet it, put plastic on it, and for 2 years, if you were to do that, you would likely get the temperature above 70 degrees Celsius, which then should theoretically kill the bacterium. But 1 year of solarization without deep tilling, I don't think you would be able to get it.
Okay. All right. Next question.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Michelle's second question is, possible to control, manage blister mites?
Mark? Any suggestions, Mark? Mark is.
I'm back. I didn't get to hear it. I lost audio for a minute with my internet.
All right, I'll repeat the question. It was from Michelle Lynch. Possible to control, manage blister mites?
Yeah, well, it's real interesting. The group are called blister mites. The one, Phalacoptus fructiphilus, is actually, its common name is the rose mite. But if you wanted to control them, the first thing to do would be that if you think that you have rose rosette, if you can't remove the pleth right away, at least cut the offending foliage out. We published that there is as high as 80 times as many mites on symptomatic foliage as on regular foliage. So that's one way to reduce mite populations it's just constant vigilance. Another thing that you can do, we're not recommending it. I have my very last graduate student, bless her, who will be finishing this December and hopefully will be publishing her work next spring, is spraying a miticide like bifenthrin. Unfortunately, it is illegal in many parts of the country. It is not illegal in Tennessee. And but the key is how often do you use it? Right now, the data shows once a month. We don't think that you need to apply it until 2 weeks after the beginning of your first flush of bloom. We are not doing it by time. Our studies are by flush of bloom, so hopefully it applies to more parts of the country. And that would be the best thing we got at the moment.
All right, next question, Karen Hicks, a CR candidate. Do any of the miticides discourage the mites that carry RRD or natural controls?
Well, I mentioned bifenthrin. There are other miticides. Unfortunately, the miticide bifenthrin is the only one that is labeled for homeowner use. The good news about it is there's over 200 products, and many of them you can order online or buy at box stores that have that as the active ingredient. The key is timing. But I'm going to tell you, miticides alone are not going to be your answer. Nothing is your answer greater than maintaining a clean garden free of rose rosette. When I hear somebody who's got a garden that says, well, I've got 20, I've lost 20 roses this year to rose rosette, that tells me that they're not as vigilant as they should have been. I recommend inspecting your garden every other day at least for anything that may look like rose rosette.
All right, the next question comes from Karen Hicks, a CR candidate. Does BioAdvantage 3-in-1 discourage beneficial insects?
Depends how you use it. If you use it as a soil drench, it should be safer. I would not recommend it spraying it especially on flowering roses, because then that's when you can have an impact on your beneficials. So that's my answer.
All right. Candidate Jan, question: how long does it take for beneficial insects to return after spraying neem oil to manage aphids, assuming that sanitation methods, companion plants, etc., are in place?
Most likely, if you use a neem oil, it doesn't have such a long residue. As soon as the residue wears off, the insects will return. But I would not recommend any type of insecticide on roses if you're interested in being organic.
All right. CR candidate KG Mildy, with a drip watering system, how many gallons would you recommend per plant per week, understanding that temperature and rainfall would come into play as well?
Boy, that's a loaded question. I cannot answer that question. Maybe one of our background experts can tell us that. Is Satish still available?
Satish,
Yes, I am, but I'm not able to answer that question either.
Okay. Yeah, that's a loaded question. It depends on your soil type, depends on your what you're gonna be doing with those roses. Depends on the location, depends on all kinds of things. That's a very complex question to ask.
well, congratulations, KG. You stumped the experts. Okay. Let's see. Connie would like to know, is neem oil spray organic?
It's considered organic. It's been used for centuries in India. It's it mainly deters insects from feeding on the plant, and it's also a fungicide. So I would say yes. I would say that's an organic material.
All right. Donald Morgan, a CR candidate, would like to ask, is there any one chemical that will control black spot, downy, and powdery mildew?
What do you think, Mark?
Well, the answer is yes, there is. And what you are looking for here is not, and I get in trouble for this. People ask me, do you grow roses organically? And I say, yeah, I use a lot of organic chemicals like chlorophyll, propiconazole, and things like that, and I get in trouble. But in this particular case, inorganic. If you use something like Mangazeb, it has zinc in it. The zinc is going to be active against all three. Copper fungicides are going to be active against all three. So in a case like this, where you're trying to, the problem is downy mildew is not a fungus. So many of the fungicides that work on black spot or cercospora or anthracnose or things like that, or powdery mildew, are not going to work on downy mildew because it's actually closer genetically related to us than it is to a fungus, although it looks like one. So you're going to have to go in inorganic, zinc, something with zinc, or something with copper.
Okay.
All right. We're out of time, folks, for Q&A session. A reminder that if your questions were not answered during the Q&A sessions today, you will get an email and your questions will be answered that way. So turning this back over to Kim.
Thank you, Gary. And thank you, Art and Baldo, for such wonderful presentations today. Also like to thank Mike and Anita, National Chairs, Mark Wyndham, Jolene Adams, Satish Prabhu. Also, did I say Mark Wyndham already? All right. So I'd like to thank you all for all your wonderful help. And thank you all for attending. This webinar will be posted on the ARS website and the YouTube channel next week. The session from last week is already there. So if you haven't taken a chance to look at it, review it, it's there. You can do that now. Let's see. Attendance for both sessions will be sent to your district chairs, also the national chairs. And new candidates will receive an email communication next week with the instructions on how to take the test. Okay, Anita, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I was just typing something. I'd like to thank everyone, and hopefully the information here has been ranked as outstanding and more people want to join us. We're people that have so much information, and we're kind of friendly, almost to the point of being pushy, but we really, really appreciate everybody who was involved. This was an awful lot of folks. Thank you. Outstanding.
Okay, great. So until next year, thank you all. Thank you all for attending, and see you then. Bye-bye.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.